Well, good evening everyone, and welcome tonight. I'm very glad and honoured to be able to make this presentation to Reasonable Faith here in Adelaide, and anybody who may be watching later on the video, on the subject of reconciling the records of the resurrection appearances of Jesus. Now, unfortunately, I had a little trouble at home because I've just connected our home system to the NBN, and my printer is connected by wireless to my computer, and at the last moment when I went to print off my prepared talk, I was not able to. However, I've had a partial recovery from that situation in that Brian was able to get it downloaded onto my phone here, so I am going to use this, and hopefully this will help me. Oops, hang on. Help me do this. Let me see. I hope this works. Yes, I've got it in very small print here in front of me, but we'll see how that goes. So, on the subject of reconciling the records of the resurrection appearances of Jesus, I want to give you an outline first of all of what I am going to be talking about. I want to talk first of all about the importance of Jesus' resurrection in Christian teaching and the Christian witness and life, and why it matters to us today. I want to just introduce the various accounts of the resurrection, and then I want to talk about a particular book. It's this book here by an author called John W. Wenham, and it's called The Easter Enigma, subtitled Are the Resurrection Accounts in Conflict? There's a couple of versions of this book, but I'm going to be referring to this and quoting some passages from it tonight. What I found in preparing this talk, I intended originally, when I suggested this subject, that I would do a representation of all the material that's presented in here. I found as I went to do that that was just far too voluminous, and so what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about aspects of this book. I will summarise the book, talk about some of the major points in it, but not everything, so it won't cover everything on the subject. In particular, we're going to look at the locations of various things relevant to these records that are in Jerusalem and near Jerusalem, and why that matters. We're going to identify certain characters in it because the characters are described in different ways in different records, and so there's a need to try to identify which one in one record is the same one in another record where they may be described differently, as far as we can do that. And then we are going to look at reconciling the accounts before I give a conclusion. Okay, now the importance of Jesus' resurrection has been recognised from the very beginning of the Christian faith, of the Christian church, from 2,000 years ago. It is the very heart of the Christian faith that Jesus rose bodily from the dead, never to die again, that he rules over all. Of course, that event does not stand in isolation in the Bible account. It goes along intimately with Jesus' miraculous birth, his death by crucifixion, his burial, then there's the resurrection, and finally his ascension to heaven, and now awaiting the one part of the sequence which has not yet happened, and that is his second coming. All these individual events which are brought to us in the biblical record are interrelated. They stand together, therefore they would fall together as well. So we can't really consider the resurrection entirely on its own. It does fit in with all the other things, and it forms a single gospel message, the good news. Now, from the beginning of the Christian church, the importance of that resurrection was recognised. Paul wrote these words in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and I'll take up his account at verse 14. Paul wrote this letter, the first of two letters in our New Testament, to the church at Corinth, which is in southern Greece, down below Athens. He wrote it in about AD 55, so it probably predates, if not the writing of the gospel records, certainly their very widespread circulation. So this is some of the things he said. Corinth was a place that, although it's not far from Athens, it was nothing like Athens. Athens was renowned for its all its philosophy and varying schools of philosophy arguing with one another, and Paul presented the gospel with some success in that city. But afterwards he went to Corinth. Corinth was a port city, a very vibrant and worldly sort of place with a great many people from all different backgrounds. And so there was a lot of competing religions there and people in a very mixed situation. There were some Jewish converts, but there were a great many Gentile converts who didn't come from any background of knowing the Old Testament, all the things that the Jews were steeped in. So there were some problems in the Corinthian church after Paul got established, but nonetheless it was a lively and interesting church that grew quite amazingly. Paul wrote these words. He had to take them to task about various things which are recorded in the first of Corinthians, and he writes this, because there were some amongst them that were saying there's no resurrection of the dead, there's no bodily resurrection, nobody can rise after they've died, and Jesus therefore didn't rise. He says, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. It's that important. More than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God, for we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead. But he did not raise him, if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, you are still in your sins. So there'd be no spiritual life if Christ hasn't risen from the dead. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ, that means they've already died, they are lost. There's no hope for them, there's no life for ourselves who are living. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are to be pitied more than all men. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. And his chapter continues on arguing for the resurrection and looking at particular features of what it means that Christ has been raised and that we will be raised too later on. So that's the importance was recognised by Paul, but even earlier than that, although the written record of Acts may not be earlier than this letter to Corinthians, the things it refers to are very, very early in the life of the church. Only several weeks, far less than a year after Jesus had died and, as the record says, rose from the dead. So we have the preaching of Peter on the day of Pentecost recorded in Acts chapter 2. Whoops, I'm going to have to be doing this a few times, I'm sorry. Acts chapter 2 and at verse 24, this is the first great detailed preaching that's been recorded. And Peter preaches to the men of Israel, thousands who were gathered there before him at this great stirring event. He talks about Jesus and who he was. He says, you, but with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. He quotes the Old Testament, and then he continues down here. He says, seeing what was ahead, he, that is David as a prophet in the Old Testament, spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was not abandoned to the grave, nor did his body see decay. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of the fact. Exalted to the right hand of God, he has received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit and has poured out what you now see and hear. And then further in verse 36, therefore let all Israel be assured of this, God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. What I quoted there was from Acts chapter 2, from verses 24, 31 to 33 and 36. So it was central to Peter's preaching at the very beginning. It was central to their own witness. They had witnessed these things, and all spiritual life and future hope of eternal life depends on Jesus' resurrection from the dead. So it's very, very important. And the New Testament records as a historical fact that Jesus did rise from the dead and that he appeared to various witnesses before he ascended to heaven. But there are 5 independent or semi-independent records of these appearances. I say semi-independent because some people argue about whether Matthew is derived at least partly from Mark, whether Luke also got a bit from Mark, and there are various theories about how these gospel accounts relate. Matthew, Mark and Luke, called the Synoptic Gospels, do seem to be somehow related to a degree, particularly Matthew and Mark. John seems to be quite different, and we'll get to that later on. But anyway, there's 5 independent records, or semi-independent records of the resurrection appearances. I've listed them here on the screen: Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. They're the 4 writers, the 4 Gospels that we know, the 4 Gospel accounts. And I've started the record at the very verse that mentions the Jesus dying on the cross and who it was that was there at the cross witnessing it, because this is where the record begins. It talks about particularly the women who were there standing on the edge of the group. There were the Roman soldiers there. There were various of the apostles, lots of the crowd coming and going. There were people railing and mocking Jesus, the chief priests and others in their party. But there were the women on the edge, and it mentions in the gospel accounts these women. So I've actually started the record at that point, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. I've also mentioned Acts here, but I've not taken that as independent because it's recognised by virtually all scholars that Luke, who wrote the Gospel, also wrote the Acts. This is his volume 2, as it were, and so the record in Acts continues on. And I've taken it up to the point in each place, each of those records, where Jesus ascends to heaven, and that's the conclusion of the Gospel record in these cases here. There's also a record of Paul in that chapter I quoted earlier, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, earlier in the chapter. It doesn't give a narrative there about what happened, but it lists certain appearances. It says that, let me just read that little bit out. It says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and from verse 3, this is important, how this list links in with the Gospels. There's no one record contains everything. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 3, Paul writes, "What I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter," or the actual word is Cephas, which is the Greek word for Peter, that's translated as Peter. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. So that's those verses 3 to 8. And it's obvious from what Paul is saying here. Whether he's listed every appearance is a different matter, a different question, and we find that when we compare it with the records in the Gospels that he hasn't listed every appearance. He's listed the ones that were important witnesses in the church, but he does list them in an order, and you can tell from the way he's presented that it is an order. Jesus appeared first to Peter. What did I say? He appeared... No, it doesn't say first. He says he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that he appeared and then. So there's a sequence there that seems to be chronological, even if he hasn't got every one listed. Okay, now I want to mention this writer, John Wenham, John W. Wenham. He lived in last century. He's no longer alive, but I want to tell you how I came to look at this. I first read this book of his called The Easter Enigma. I think it does also have a different name in another edition. It is subtitled Are the Resurrection Accounts in Conflict? And so it's all about reconciling the accounts. My dear father left me this book with a note. My father died about 6 years ago, and he was a great scholar, far more than I was, a lay scholar. But he left me a message that he said he found this book very interesting and helpful, And he saw it on special, so he thought I might find it equally helpful. So here it is. Happy reading, love from my dad. So it was a memento of my dad that I'd had for many years sitting on my shelf. Never got to look at it. Thought, well, one day I'll read that. Anyway, a year or so ago, I actually did read it. And as my dad had suggested, I actually did find it a very good book. I've since read a number of books of this Wenham. And I did find too that I've got this book of his from way back when I did endeavour to learn a bit of New Testament Greek, which I never did very successfully. But he wrote a book that's quite a well-known book in theological circles in English-speaking countries, introducing people to New Testament Greek because he was quite a scholar. He was an Anglican, and let me just read something to you of what is said about him. He lived from 1913 to 1996. He's an Anglican Bible scholar who devoted his professional life to academic and pastoral work. He was a conservative theologian. He was a defender of biblical inerrancy, actually, who from his studies inferred a very early date for each of the synoptic Gospels. He's written about this in this book here, redating Matthew, Mark and Luke, a fresh assault on the synoptic problem. I've not read that book, but that's one I would like to read. He's also written these books here, The Enigma of Evil. It's interesting he's used this word enigma in two titles, but Can We Believe the Goodness of God? So he deals very comprehensively with the issue of evil and all the things that people don't like about the biblical record and relating to evil and violence and so on. I have read that and I found that really good. And Christ in the Bible, I've been reading some of that book as well. So I have really appreciated this John W. Wenham. Now, let me just quote from his book, early on in his book, where he tells how he came to look himself at this subject. It's obvious from his earliest days that he was a conservative scholar that had a very high regard for the record and delved in detail into every word in here and read all the arguments about things. He writes here, he says, I first became interested in the subject in 1945. Oh, thanks, Han. Thanks a lot. When living in Jerusalem, so he actually lived there, not far from the old walled city, I got to know the sites in and around the city intimately. I had no real doubts that the gospel writers were honest and well-informed people, providentially equipped by God to give the church a sound account of these events, but I was by no means committed to the view that the accounts were correct in every detail. Indeed, I was impressed in my early studies of the resurrection stories by the seemingly intractable nature of the discrepancies, and that's the issue. You've got these 5 records, and it's said that the differences between those records are so great that they cannot be reconciled. Apparently, so Wenham says in reviewing all the things that are said about this, that even some conservative scholars would say that, who have a high regard for the text. They say, well, you just cannot reconcile these things. So he decided to look at it himself in a very careful way. But he started with that point of view, that, how on earth could you reconcile these things? The most obvious point of difficulty concerns the events of the first Easter morning, where Luke mentions at least 5 women at the tomb, while Mark refers to 3, Matthew to 2, John to 1, and Paul to none at all. John puts the visit at the tomb while it was still dark, and Mark when the sun had risen. Mark's and Luke's messengers are men. Mark has 1, Luke has 2, while Matthew's and John's are angels. Matthew has 1 and John has 2. Mark, Luke and John locate them inside the tomb, while Matthew's angel starts outside the tomb and finishes inside. Matthew tells of an appearance of Christ to a number of women who held his feet unrebuked, while John tells of an appearance to one woman who is forbidden to touch him. That is Mary Magdalene, who we'll come to look at in a minute. As to appearances to the 11, Matthew only records 1 in Galilee, while Luke only records an appearance at Jerusalem. It is by no means easy to see how these things can be fitted together while remaining strictly faithful to what the writers say, but an insatiable curiosity made me want to know who did what and why each writer put things so. Reading all I could and studying the Greek text carefully, I gradually found many of the pieces of the jigsaw coming together. It now seems to me that these resurrection stories exhibit in a remarkable way the well-known characteristics of accurate and independent reporting, for superficially they show great disharmony, but on close examination the details gradually fall into place. That's the thesis of his book. And unfortunately, I won't have time to review all that tonight. But if I leave you with anything, I hope that I'll whet your appetite to look carefully at the Bible records. And if you like, to find that book or borrow my copy and to read through it. It's made me feel, having read it, I really need to read it again carefully. There's a lot of notes at the back. All the texts are quoted. So, and he deals with individual words as well, what one writer says here and there and so on. And it's really quite a wonderful book, I find, and I would commend it to you. Anyway, what he does first is to look at Jerusalem. Since he lived there, and he went round to all these sites. So I just want to talk about Jerusalem itself in the time of Jesus and its nearby environs. What I found in reading Wenham is that none of his reasoning is strained. It's not really trying to force things. It really does all come together. And I must look at it once again. So, what I said, Wenham in his book, first of all, he considers the layout of Jerusalem and its surroundings in the time of Jesus. Then he looks at the main characters. He looks at what we know about the authors of those four gospel accounts, and according to Christian tradition, which he does hold highly, though not necessarily correct in all its details, but the early traditions as to who wrote the different gospels, because none of them had the names on them, like Matthew's gospel. From the earliest days, every record that we've had, the church believed it was Matthew who wrote it. There are some internal signs along the lines of what I presented a few lectures ago, that it was Matthew who wrote it, but his name is actually not on the document. Nor the same applies to any of the others. It's believed that the second gospel, Mark, is actually the recollections of the Apostle Peter, and given to John Mark, a young disciple at the time, who comes into the record later on. Luke, written by the physician, the doctor, who was a companion of Paul. The Gospel of John, written by the Apostle John, who, it turns out, was a cousin of Jesus, because the mother of John and his brother James was the sister of Mary. So, and that comes out in trying to identify who these different women are. Now, Matthew, again, the earliest Christian traditions, and John Wenham believes that this is the case, was the first gospel to be written, he thinks, and he thinks it was extremely early. And I think there are reasons why it was so early, which explain why the resurrection appearances that he records are as they are. We'll get to that in a moment. So he looks at the characters, he looks at who their sources might have been. Of course, we believe that a Christian like myself would believe that the Holy Spirit superintended all this, that God's revealed it. But nonetheless, at the same time, all the records we believe had human sources. Luke, in fact, tells us how he went about writing his gospel, that he actually went and spoke to all those people who were eyewitnesses and who were intimately involved in Jesus' life from the earliest times. So no doubt he interviewed Mary, his mother. He interviewed lots and lots of people and carefully put everything together in compiling his record. The fact that it was under God's direction by the Spirit doesn't undo the necessity, doesn't undo the fact that he would have had input from human beings. So Wenham endeavours to work out who would have been the major sources of information to each of the writers as well. And it's all very plausible what he has in his book. Anyway, just talking about the topography of Jerusalem, I've got a number of slides here that show, this is looking at Jerusalem, the old part of the city from the south. I think it's a relatively modern photograph. You can see in the middle here, the Dome of the Rock. So that's generally where the temple area was. You can see some of the walls around the city. The old city of Jerusalem comes down from that. This is looking from the south, roughly north. And over on the eastern side, there's a deep valley called the Kidron Valley. There's a brook that flows through here, and it comes around to the south into the Hinnom Valley here. So it sort of connects like that. And there's a ridge which comes down here. Jerusalem is quite a mountainous place. The temple's on a promontory. Up this way is Mount Moriah. Mount Zion is over here. This part was called Ophel, and that part is the oldest part of the city, the old ancient core, the eastern ridge, that dates back to King David's time. So Jerusalem's changed a lot over the years, and the wall has been modified and extended all the way down into post-Christian times, into Turkish times, in the time of the Crusaders and everything. So the archaeologists have a heck of a lot of work to do in Jerusalem, and they have been working there for many, many years in different parts, trying to work out what part of the wall belongs to what period, digging down, finding out what's low down. Because between this part here, there's a central valley which in time has filled up. I think that's called the Tyrophean Valley, and that separates this raised part here, the western ridge, from this eastern ridge, which all come down to a tongue at the end. Anyway, so some things are known as to where they are. So that the location of the temple was roughly where the Dome of the Rock is now, in that general area. The fortress of Antonia, where the Roman soldiers were all garrisoned, is known. The judgment hall of Pilate, the palace of Herod, these are known. What's not quite known is where Caiaphas had his rather grand house, also called a palace. He was the high priest, and that was thought to be down in a certain area. I think if we go on to the next slide, I might see a bit more. What I want to show here too is beyond that valley, you've got the Mount of Olives. So that's over to the east of Jerusalem. And Bethany, the little township of Bethany, and another township of Bethphage was beyond that. The Bible tells us that Bethany was 2 miles from Jerusalem, or whatever. There was the ancient measurement, but it equates to 2 miles or 3 kilometres over here, within easy walking distance to Jerusalem. This is like a plan view. You can see here the different quarters of the old city, and again you've got the Kidron Valley through here, you've got the Mount of Olives over here. Gethsemane is somewhere down here, low down, and you've got what's known as the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross, runs across through here. The garden tomb is out there, but the most likely location of the tomb is actually here, the Holy Sepulchre. Wenham looks at these two places because from the earliest days, the traditional site for the burial of Jesus is here, which was outside the walls of the town, of the city at the time, I believe, or at least the site of the crucifixion was outside the walls. But in much more recent times, about 1900, somebody thought there was reason for this garden tomb. I know my father has been to Israel, and where he went on some tour and he spent some time on his own going around there. He felt that when he went to the Holy Sepulchre, like a lot of very long established churches there, he didn't find it very satisfying because it was very gaudy and commercialised. It was a very noisy, crowded place and didn't feel very reverent to him at all. So it wasn't conducive for reflection and worship. But when he went out to the garden tomb, there's some very ancient trees out there and some ancient parts of the wall and what could be a tomb, now a vacant tomb with stone rolled away. It felt, the atmosphere was really wonderful, he found, and it was a place to reflect and worship, and indeed people were gathered there and sang hymns and prayers and so on. So it was quite a lovely experience. So he felt that that felt good. I can understand that, but at the same time, it may not be authentic. And this site has been believed to be the authentic site since about 300 AD, when Constantine's mother, who was a devout Christian, when the Roman Empire was just being Christianised, and Constantine was allegedly the first Christian emperor, she led an expedition to the Holy Land, and their task, directed by her, was to locate all the places of significance. So it was a long time after the events, but that's where they came up with that, where they came up with, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, where they found various other sites that may or may not be true. Now, as it turns out, I'm actually going there myself very soon. I'm very excited about going to Israel. I'm actually heading off next Monday night and going through briefly in Europe, but I'll be in Israel in less than, in 1 week's time. 1 week I'll actually arrive, and very soon after I arrive I'm actually going up to Jerusalem. I'm very keen, this is my first trip ever over there, I'm very keen to go around and look at all these places. I'm going to have a whole month in Israel. I want to walk all over the place and visit all the holy sites, and I'm looking forward to all this very, very much. So maybe on another occasion, maybe I'll be able to tell you something of this. In any case, I'm very, very excited about doing this. But so the traditional sites may or may not be true, but Wenham looks very logically at what would establish the validity of one site or another. And he thinks that there were 4 points he makes, I remember in his book, about this, all of which are satisfied about this traditional site, and only one of which was satisfied about the garden tomb. So he concludes that, in his view, it's more likely that the traditional site was the place where Jesus was buried. But anyway, so he establishes where different things are. Now, there's also... what else was I going to say? You can see the walls around the city. There might be on another slide. Let's have a look. Here's another one that shows, this is simpler, the temple area, the Antonia Fortress, Herod's palace over here, the question mark on the high priest's palace down here, and a question mark on the upper room here. Here's the valley of Hinnom, or Gehenna, down this way. Here's the Kidron Valley, and there is a valley through this part here as well, but not as pronounced as this valley. Garden of Gethsemane, down in the valley, and then Bethany and Bethphage. Bethphage is not exactly known, but it's associated with Bethany, and Bethany's only a short, few kilometres from Jerusalem. Right, now, once again, another picture of all that. I don't think there's anything new to explain about that. Jerusalem was a very densely built-up city, with lots of, probably not quite as rectangular grid as that, but lots and lots of buildings, some grand and others not. Now, Now, let's look at Matthew first. I won't have time to deal very thoroughly with this. Hopefully it'll just whet your appetite. Now, Matthew, in his record, begins that section that I mentioned with these words. This is, I'm reading always from the New International Version, by the way, but this is from Matthew chapter 20... hang on, where am I? We're looking into Matthew chapter 27. Oh, first of all, I'll mention about chapter 28, his final chapter. Now, I must admit here to a misunderstanding which I've long had about these accounts myself. I've always believed that they could be reconciled, but I never actually tried to do it myself. I've always been, for a long, long time, since childhood, familiar with all these records. I learnt lots of parts from them, and sort of in my mind had them roughly worked out. I always thought that the account in Matthew 28, which talks about the Great Commission, that's when it finishes up saying, Jesus said, all authority in heaven and earth is given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptising them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. They're the final words in verses 18 to 20 of Matthew chapter 28, the final words in his gospel. Very, very grand conclusion, very powerful, assuring words from Jesus. I will be with you always. All authority is in my hands. You go and make, he's commissioning them to this is the Great Commission, as the heading in my Bible says. The heading's not inspired, but that's quite fair enough that they've called it that. Now, I always imagined that was the ascension of Jesus, that correlated with what we read in Acts chapter 11 about them going up finally onto the Mount of Olives by Jerusalem, crossing down the Kidron Valley, going up the Mount of Olives, and Jesus being up there with them, with the 12, and that's recorded in Acts chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. And then finally Jesus being parted from them and being carried up into heaven, and they were standing gazing up into heaven, and angels appeared to them and said, "You men of Galilee, why stand you gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus who is taken from you into heaven shall so come in like manner as you have seen him go into heaven." And then they went back into Jerusalem. And I always thought those two went together because that too is very, very grand. Both events are on a mountain, but when you look closely at the detail, when you take it in, they're not the same event. Matthew is in Galilee and it's on a mountain up there. It doesn't actually record him ascending to heaven, it's just him saying these words. That's the final thing he says. Whereas Luke's account of the ascension is here by Jerusalem, and it's actually quite different. Different things are said altogether. And there's no reason why you'd need to think that they were together, that they were the same event. In fact, they're not. So that's what can easily happen. And I think that, I've known these things very well from childhood, and I think I read intelligently in my reading, but for many, many years I've been under that misunderstanding myself. So you really need to look carefully at everything that's said and why. Now, Matthew doesn't mention the Mount of Olives or the Ascension. He leaves it in Galilee, and it seems that Matthew is pointing readers' attention, anybody who would read his gospel, to Galilee. Now, there might be a reason for this, why he's doing this. Much of Jesus' ministry had been in Galilee, and Matthew is the one, he's not the only one who mentions that the message that Jesus gave them was to go and I'll meet you in Galilee. Go to Galilee. But Matthew particularly records that. He mentions Galilee about 3 times through that chapter 28. For example, in verse chapter 28 and verse 7, he says, this is what the angel said to the women, "Then go quickly, tell his disciples he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I've told you." Later on in verse 10, it says, Jesus said to them, Jesus met them as they were hurrying from the tomb, and they worshipped him. Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There you will see me." And then later on, verse 16, just before the bit I mentioned, that the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. So it's very clear. All attention's directed away from Jerusalem to Galilee. Now, if Matthew wrote very early, that would make sense, because Matthew is endeavouring if he's the first gospel to be written, John Wenham thinks he is, and that's why it's first in the canon too. He's directing people's attention to Galilee away so that the authorities, who were very hostile in Jerusalem, there might be some relief of the church and the church leaders who were in Jerusalem from the authorities. Of course, there was opposition in Galilee as well, but the heart of the opposition to Jesus' ministry was in Jerusalem. That makes sense to me as to why he might do that. He doesn't tell us, but that's a reasonable supposition, I think. Now, a significant factor in understanding the narratives is to deduce where the various characters may have been staying. Now, we know in the final week, Holy Week, as we call it, Jesus was staying out at Bethany, to the east, and he went in every day into Jerusalem. He generally came in to the temple, which was on that side, and taught in the temple, was regularly teaching. Great crowds gathered to him in the temple, and then in the evening he would go back to Bethany, probably staying at the home of Lazarus and Mary and Martha out there, or nearby. At the time of the feasts, thousands, I think I've read somewhere, maybe even 1 million people came to Jerusalem. There were 3 feasts in the year, Passover, Pentecost and the Feast of Tabernacles. It would have been a bit like the Hajj, the Muslim Hajj, where the people all go down to Mecca. And there's an obligation on them to do that. There was an obligation that the Jews felt to do that. So even up as far as Galilee, the men especially, but families would travel down to attend the religious feast and holy day in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was absolutely packed at these times. Everybody, every inn and camping ground would have been packed and overflowing. Everybody who had relations here, every bed would have been occupied in the nights, and not only in Jerusalem but all the surrounding villages as well. Jesus and the 12, it appears, stayed out at Bethany prior to the crucifixion. Now, time's whizzing by. I'll just mention a couple of things here. Perhaps I'll have to leave aside the identification of the women as to how people are referred to differently in the different Gospels. But I want to just say that they weren't necessarily all out there at Bethany. I think Jesus and the 12 were, but there were others who were in his band, like the women in particular. Now, Mary Magdalene is probably, very, very likely, and Wenham devotes a chapter to Mary Magdalene in here, identifying her with the Mary, the sister of Lazarus and sister of Martha, and also the repentant sinner of Luke. She is the one to whom Jesus first appeared, and she takes a prominent place in the record. She's in the whole record. She really is second only in importance to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, it's very interesting too, this is an aside, that in all of these records, there's 10 resurrection appearances of Jesus when they're all listed there, and we'll get to that. The first one to Mary Magdalene. Jesus does not actually appear to his mother. Now, given the way the Christian church developed and how really not too far down the track, a few generations later, Mary was in such an elevated position, you would have thought that if Christians were going to fabricate something or doctor the records, surely there would have been Jesus appearing to his beloved mother. She who was blessed above all women, who bore the Saviour, surely there would have been an appearance. There's not. People have tried to invent this, and you'll find them in the apocryphal Gospels, things like that, but they're not. It's not in here. He didn't appear to Mary, he appeared to Mary Magdalene. There's something absolutely wonderful about this too, that goes to the that to me I find very, very tender. Women were not highly regarded in those days, probably in most eras, right up to the modern era in the Western society. And certainly in that society, both in Jewish and Roman and pagan societies, women were very regarded very inferior to men. Jesus, the most central thing in the gospel is Jesus' resurrection. Jesus appears first to Mary Magdalene. This woman who might have been thought of as being less than other women even, certainly less than Mary, his mother. Mary, by the way, was the most common name for women at the time, so there's quite a lot of Marys, and that leads to some confusion. And I haven't got time now to go into that. But he appears to Mary Magdalene, this woman who, if these things fit together, was a woman who'd had a rather unsavoury past, but had been touched by Jesus and who'd come to such a devotion in her life, devoted love to Jesus, as to be one of his ardent followers, and who seems to have grasped what Jesus was about more than even Peter and James and John did, because one of the events which triggers the crucifixion is actually this grossly extravagant act of anointing Jesus by this Mary. I think it's the same one that's recorded in detail in John's Gospel, and that seems to be the final trigger, because it's from that point that Judas went to the authorities to betray him. There was all this outrage. What's this terrible waste? This perfume that was worth a year's wages, it would have been extremely extravagant. And I can understand, it doesn't take much imagination to think of how people would have been at least embarrassed and perhaps outraged at what was going on here. Jesus says, leave her alone. What she has done has been in preparation for my burial. It seems that she knew something, appreciated something, and wanted to show her great love for Jesus at that time. Anyway, all that. It just, to me, the fact that Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene first fits together with the whole biblical narrative that God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. And you see that exemplified in a Jesus relationship with this Mary Magdalene. It doesn't, it goes together with him being born in the stable, no room in the inn. Heck, is there going to be any room in Bethlehem at all for him? He's in an inn surrounded by sheep and cattle. And who comes to see him? Shepherds, not grand people, but shepherds. They come in from the field, It just fits all together so wonderfully. And look, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit diverted there, aren't I? So I was saying that, there were other women as well. Mary Magdalene, then she may have been out at Bethany. But the other women, you can work out that the Apostle John had a house, a substantial house in Jerusalem. Now, he was from Galilee. Remember how John was known to the high priest? Because when Jesus was taken when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, that's where he was arrested in the night, and this group of maybe soldiers, or certainly a great band with sticks and clubs and everything, came out with their torches out to get Jesus out at the Garden of Gethsemane there, and then what ensued at the Garden of Gethsemane, all the disciples forsook Jesus and fled. Now, the logical place where they would flee would be along this road here back to Bethany, where they had been staying every night prior to that. They'd been going back and forth. But Peter and John fled initially, but thought better of it, and then they followed this party as Jesus was led back into the city through one of these gates. There's a whole series of gates around here, and it came down to the high priest's palace down here. Now, John had access there because it says twice in John's Gospel that he was known to the high priest. Well, why was he known to the high priest? And there's a bit I've read only just recently back in Nehemiah. It talks about Nehemiah, this is 500 years prior to this, talks about there being a fish gate up around here and all of a sudden. It says how he was very ardent about establishing the holiness of the Saturday, the Sabbath. People had to keep the Sabbath. It was very important at that time. And so Nehemiah, as the leader, I can give you a reference here, but it's near the end of Nehemiah. He deals with the foreign marriages, but he also deals with this matter of the Sabbath. And he says, why are all these people coming in and trading on the Sabbath day? Stop that. And it says that the Sidonians came down. This is just in passing. It's no great point. The people from Sidon came down to sell fish in Jerusalem, Now Sidon is on the coast, it's up in modern-day Lebanon, up that way, and that's even further than the Sea of Galilee. But the fishermen, presumably the fish were salted in baskets and that, they were brought down to, because it was a substantial trade. You had all these people living in Jerusalem, especially at the times of feast, so they'd come down to sell the stuff. And they did this from time immemorial, hundreds of years earlier. Nehemiah says, they've got to stop doing this. So he takes action to make them respect the Sabbath, closes the gates, and then they camp outside. He says, get lost, If you camp out there again, I'm going to send people out there to deal with you. So they didn't come on the Sabbath, and he was able to establish the holiness of that day. But that's an illustration of the fact that there was fish being traded down into Jerusalem. If anything, it would have been more substantial in the time of Jesus. And so it's no great stretch of the imagination that John and his father Zebedee, and they had boats, more than one boat, and servants up on the Sea of Galilee. They were fishermen. They probably had a reasonable business, selling not just up in Galilee, but also down into Jerusalem. And John had a house, seems a substantial house, in Jerusalem in order to facilitate this. So he could well have supplied the high priest's palace and other places with fish, be known to the staff there, because he'd been doing this for years. Now, the fact that there was John's house here as well is interesting, because remember how Jesus arranged the Last Supper? They're out here, and Judas had decided to betray Jesus. He was looking for an opportunity. Jesus said to two of his disciples, go into the city and you'll see a man, follow this man, and he'll show you an upper room. Why didn't he say, look, go to 16 George Street, and that's where it's going to be? Because Jesus was controlling all that. He was in control, and it was not time for him to be betrayed. That was not the right time. So it needed to be kept secret from Judas, so that Judas, and therefore the people he was informing, wouldn't know where the Last Supper was to be, which means that there were at least two locations, perhaps more, where it could have been. So John had a substantial house here where a number of people were staying. There was also another house in the city which is referred to later on in the record, John Mark's house. There's John and John Mark, but that's how it is. And that became an important home too later on in the Christian record. It was obviously a substantial house because quite a lot of people gathered there. And the record of that is in Acts, about Acts chapter 13, I think. And the early church was there. So some of the women were staying there. There was also a Joanna and a Susanna. And it's those people of substantial means who provided for Jesus and the disciples, even when they were in Galilee, provided materially for them to support their ministry. And one of them, Joanna, was the wife of the steward of Herod. Now it seems that this steward is not just like a waiter, but was probably, given Herod's position, he was probably like minister for finance in the province. So a very high position, and it would be very likely that Herod and all his such ministers and staff and those associated would have been staying in Herod's palace. So there were a number of places where they were, and when you put all this together, I wish there was more time, but there isn't. Working out where people went to, where different individuals would have been at different times, the record actually does make sense, and it all actually does come together. So what you finally end up with are these resurrection appearances here. That first of all, there was a series of 6 appearances over 2 weeks in or near Jerusalem. The very first Easter Sunday morning to Mary Magdalene alone. Although she went there with others, they went and they found the tomb open, and Mary Magdalene immediately ran back to John and Peter, who would have been most likely staying in John's house in Jerusalem, not with the other ones. Remember how they got separated when Jesus was arrested? John and Peter went into Jerusalem, the others probably all went back to Bethany. So John and Peter are in John's home in Jerusalem at that point, and Mary Magdalene, on finding that the tomb was empty, and the surprising things that ran to tell Peter and John. Peter and John went to have a look, and then went back home. Mary Magdalene was there on her own at that stage. Now, one other thing too, it mentions in John's Gospel, for example, John has a reason for talking about Mary Magdalene in John chapter 20. And you'd get the impression from just reading John superficially that Mary Magdalene was on her own, whereas the others say there were other women there. But John's record doesn't actually say she was on her own. And in fact, there's two things here. One is that it would be most unlikely that a woman would be on her own in darkness or near darkness early in the morning going through Jerusalem at that time without arranging to be with others, in the company of others. So it's most unlikely, for one thing. And the second thing is that in what Mary says, she says, if I can find it, this is John chapter 20 and verse 2, she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, John we think, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they have put him." So although she was on her own, the record only mentions her, she comes to John and there's an indication in what she says that she was actually with others. So it doesn't say specifically she was on her own. But anyway, Jesus did appear to Mary Magdalene, and then he appeared to the other women who had got separated, because they went to tell the other disciples were in a different location. They had to be told. So then there was the appearance to Cleopas and companion that's recorded in Luke, and then an appearance to Peter, and then to the 10 apostles and others who were there as well, but Thomas was not amongst them on that Sunday evening. So all this is virtually one day, these appearances. Then it's the following Sunday when Jesus appeared to the 11, which included Thomas. So you've got that account in John's Gospel where Thomas says, "Unless I see the prints in his hands and the sword wound in his side, I won't believe." And Jesus comes to him and says, "Look and see, blessed are those who haven't seen and yet believe." And he says, "My Lord and my God." And then the other appearances are up in Galilee, and where Jesus appears to the 7 by the Lake of Tiberias, which is recorded in John's Gospel, then to more than 500 brothers in the hills. So that's a kind of a recreation of the feeding of the 5,000 up there, a huge crowd away from the authorities in Jerusalem. Then he appears to the Lord's brother, and then finally back in Jerusalem, which is some weeks after the resurrection, which is the final appearance to the 11 recorded in Acts chapter 1, which is followed by the ascension from the Mount of Olives. Now there's a heck of a lot more I could cover in that, but that is the summary of the appearances, and all I can do is commend that book and commend a careful reading of the account to you. So where we get to after this, the conclusion that I want to put to you is that the resurrection of Jesus is vital to Christian faith and life. The Bible's accounts of Jesus' resurrection appearances are able to be reconciled in a reasonable and plausible way that does take into account all Bible passages and also early Christian traditions. It does take them into account. And I would commend this book to you, Easter Enigma by John Wenham. And a conclusion that it takes me to, once again, is that we can have confidence in the Bible record. There's things in there which are puzzling, but it can all be made sense of, and it's very, very wonderful, and it's a very important message. So the final point that I would say is, read the Bible, because we actually can have confidence in it. It has got a life-changing and life-giving message, and we need to read it regularly, carefully, and reverentially. Thank you for your attention.
All right, so some of you may already have in mind some questions, but I guess I'll start with one. And that is, I've heard what you said in terms of when you've got a number of recounts of an event, different people will focus on different things. So if someone is focused on Mary and talked about Mary, that doesn't mean that there weren't other women there. Okay, so I hear that. But if it were in fact that that one of the writers was wrong in that at that point, and that someone has said there were 2 women when really there were 4, would that matter hugely to?
Well, obviously, people have thought that down through the ages, including, as Wenham says, even conservative scholars, that you can't reconcile all these accounts, and presumably those that have come to that conclusion have done so after some investigation and thought, and yet they've still maintained, I would think, if they're conservative, that they would still have some kind of robust faith. So obviously people can get to that position of having faith and yet still not thinking that the accounts all add up, that there are some differences. However, I kind of think that it would impact my overall, I would end up with a lesser view of the Bible, that I would think, I can't trust everything that's said in it if I find serious discrepancies.
Okay.
It could be that there are errors in transmission and things like that too. In my own thinking, I do have a very high view of the Bible record, but I'm not against manuscript analysis of the manuscripts and how manuscripts have been transmitted from one to another, and the fact that there are some differences. I think the differences in manuscripts are much less than what some people would say, much less significant. But nonetheless, there are such things. There is a field of study to do that and work out what did the original actually say, and there are some differences in various categories of manuscripts.
But the main point is that Jesus rose from the dead, and then people saw him after he died and then risen. Right, that's the main point, right? Not that the people that wrote about it got everything right.
That is true. I agree with that.
I mean,
I have felt heartened at finally coming to read this book of Wenham's, and I did read it very carefully, and it all sounded plausible to me. Now, my faith doesn't depend on Wenham getting it right. If later on I find out maybe there's some other scholars who will criticise what Wenham has written and say, hey, he's actually wrong here or there. Maybe he is. I didn't see it, but maybe he is. And that won't make me throw away faith because of that. So
I think everybody who comments on the Synoptic Gospels, whether they be conservative or liberal, whatever scholars in this area, is of the opinion that Matthew and Luke used Mark and had Mark available to them when they were writing their Gospels.
Yeah.
If they wrote something different when they had Mark in front of them, they would have known exactly what they were writing, and either they deliberately did something that they knew to be wrong, or else they knowingly just put other details in that were important to them and did it knowing that it all did fit together and just included the bits that they needed to. And if they were trying to be believable and they had something in front of them, you'd think they would have copied it exactly if they were afraid of getting something wrong that way.
Yeah. The fact that there are differences between the Gospels is actually an indication that they are independent accounts, because that's just what you would get from independent testimony about anything. And if they were all really uniform and you'd think, oh, this has been doctored. People have come along and made sure that there aren't any, that it all sort of matches up exactly. The greatest thing is when there's apparent discrepancies, which then end up being explained. Now, another thing that Wenham does in here, he's got a number of appendices in the book too about related issues, which are really worth reading. But he deals with the ending of Mark's Gospel. There's been a lot of dispute about Mark chapter 16, and because it seems that the Gospel ends at about verse 8, I think it is, and that verses 9 to 20 don't fit. Other scholars have argued, yes, it does fit, but Wenham looks at all the arguments both ways and the particular points, and he concludes, as you might not be surprised, that it's actually authentic. And I've actually read other scholars about that too, and there are definitely reasons why that section is authentic, although there are
Do you know
issues to be considered.
What some of those arguments are?
Well, for example, Mary Magdalene is introduced in verse 9 as though she hasn't been mentioned before. This is one thing that's said, whereas in fact she has already been there.
Yeah.
But it is a little bit subjective. You know, the fact that she's mentioned in a certain way does that, people are reading into it saying, well, she's being introduced as though she's new to the narrative. She's actually been back there. Well, does that really hold?
Marys, you'd think they'd be a bit careful.
Yeah, there are a lot of Marys. Mary was a very common name, and also early on he has a whole chapter about Mary Magdalene, and I know that you can't be 100% certain about identification of certain characters, like Mary Magdalene is certainly prominent, but is she the Mary in the household of Martha and Lazarus as well, who lived down at Bethany? Because Brian pointed out to me, I know Magdala is right up in the north, I think it's on the Sea of Galilee actually, so I'm hoping to actually go there. I'm hoping to walk around the whole Sea of Galilee and see things there, 60 kilometres all around. I won't do it in one day. I want to swim in the sea as well.
You're going to camp. Is this going to be the longest hike?
Yeah, I'm going to do a lot of hiking in this,
fantastic.
right? Yeah, I'm very keen. This is why I'm going on my own too. I'd be happy for other people to come with me, but my wife won't do the walking that I want to do, so I'm going to walk all over the place.
Okay.
And stay cheaply.
Well,
what am I going to
it's
say?
difficult for you to do that on your own if you're a female today. So we talk about the male-female thing 2,000 years ago, but even today there's some differences there.
Yeah, I appreciate that, yeah. Can I just mention too about Mary's, that I've been informed that there's a subject that was done a while ago by Kevin on Reasonable Faith, which should be accessible through YouTube, when he actually dealt with the Marys of the New Testament, or he endeavoured to analyse it. So I haven't seen it myself, but it is a very worthwhile subject to try to sort these things out. There's quite a number of Marys in the New Testament. There's at least 2 Johns, there's at least 2 Jameses as well, and occasionally a person can be referred to in one way, like for example the mother of Zebedee's children, the mother of Zebedee's sons, and in one gospel, and it turns out another gospel, she's the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus, so that James and John, the 2 of the foremost apostles, were actually cousins of Jesus, and really the way in which you trace their movements in Galilee, Jesus was probably actually closer to them than you'd expect for cousins. They were almost like brothers to him. And this could account for why they and their mother thought that they had some claim on Jesus. Remember they came to Jesus and says, can you do me a favour, when you come into your kingdom, I want James to sit on your left and John on your right in your kingdom. Or, there's a background to that. And of course, the other disciples were rather incensed that they'd been undercut. Well, they'd been cut out by this attempt. So there's something else I was going to mention too. Another thing too. Talking about how the Gospels are related, there's quite a lot of ideas about Mark being prior and Matthew and Luke taking some material from Mark and from elsewhere. This may be true, but there are other scholars who say other things. On the other hand, John, the Gospel of John, does appear to be very different from the other 3. This is not just in the account at the end of Jesus' life, but also all the way through. John seems to deal with things that don't figure in the other Gospels. And it's been suggested, quite plausibly I think, that John actually, or some think that John wrote later, and that he had the others before him, and he deliberately supplemented what was in those Gospels. There's only a number of incidents which are in John and all of them, like for example the Transfiguration, which is such an important event that John writes of that too. But even that he deals with in a somewhat of a different way than the others. Doesn't mean that they're contradictory. It's just that he is bringing out certain things. He certainly deals with all the discussions that Jesus had in a way that's not recorded in the other Gospels.
It's a very different sort of personality, I would say, and a very different sort of writer. He writes very poetically and he's, sort of regarded as a spiritual writer, isn't he? And John, the Gospel of John is very lovely. That's if you equate otherworldly with spirituality, I suppose. He writes a bit more triply than the others, doesn't he? Yeah. It's a bit more, I don't know.
But then there's some other writers say that John was early in his writing. And I personally, I can think that it makes sense to me that all Gospel writers were very early, really, even though we can't know these things for sure. But the Christian community and the Jewish community before that had attached great importance to teaching. The Jews in particular regarded education very highly, especially for their boys. The girls might just be, learn home duties and that, but the boys from the youngest age would go to the synagogue school, and it was important for them to learn to read, very important, and to read. They were literate people, and they had a high regard for their scriptures, for knowing them and memorising them. Memory was a great thing back then. So I just think it would be logical, if nothing else, that the Christian community would want to record all these things from the earliest time. So there may well have been oral traditions behind those writings. There may have been collections of things that were later compiled, but I think there would be very good reason why it was all really early.
Does anyone have any questions?
Can you go back? You talked about I can't recall the two things about the early in the morning or before light.
Yeah.
And then the other one was.
Look, I had intended to quote a few bits from here because Wenham puts it better than I can and so succinctly. And there was a bit in here about the time of day, and it really doesn't amount to anything much. Here we are.
My question is related to it, so maybe you can read the issue and then I'll ask my question.
Well, Wenham first, he says this, at what time did the women arrive, talking about the very first going to the tomb and finding it empty. So he quotes from Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, puts these passages together, and he says there's very close agreement of testimony here. And he's quoting these actual quotes. Toward the dawn, very early, at early dawn, while it was still dark. Except for Mark, who has the appearance of contradicting himself. In the ancient world, very early would hardly describe what we mean by when the sun had risen. In our day, to use the language of the nautical almanac, sunrise denotes the moment when the upper limb of the sun appears to be on the horizon, but that's a very sort of precise, modern way of defining things, which is broad daylight. Sunrise in biblical usage, however, means break of day. We have an Old Testament account of a dawn attack taking place, this is a quote, as soon as the sun is up, and a psalm which refers to the night animals returning to their lairs when the sun rises. So Mark is not contradicting himself, he is referring to a time when the day had broken. There is perhaps no need to insist upon any distinction between Matthew's toward the dawn, Mark's very early, Luke's early dawn, and John's while it was still dark. Darkness and light are relative terms, and it would be perfectly possible and not inaccurate for one person to describe the time as early dawn, which another described as still dark.